My name is Addison and I am 29. For most of my life, I believed that family was a circle where the love you poured in eventually made its way back to you. I grew up in a household where my role was defined early on as the provider, the fixer, and the silent engine. My parents, Martha and Silas, were people who valued appearances above all else, and my younger sister, Bianca, was their golden standard. While I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks in corporate finance, sacrificing my social life and my sleep to build a massive savings account, Bianca spent hers finding herself on their dime. When their dime ran out, they turned to mine. I didn't mind at first because I thought I was buying belonging. I thought if I paid for the vacations, the medical bills, and the holiday feasts, I would finally earn a seat at the table that didn't feel like it was folding under me. This year was supposed to be the pinnacle of my generosity. My parents had been talking for years about a grand family reunion, a massive summer-style gala in the middle of December to celebrate our heritage, and the fact that Silas was turning 65. They described a vision of a rented estate, catering that rivaled 5-star restaurants, and a guest list that included every distant cousin and influential family friend we had ever known. The problem was they had no money. They had spent their retirement fund on Bianca's failed boutique business and a series of bad investments. So they came to me. They sat me down in October, plied me with tea and memories of my childhood, and asked if I could fund the event. They called it a legacy project. They told me it would be the moment the family finally saw us as the success we were. I agreed. I didn't just agree. I went above and beyond. I transferred $40,000 into a joint account with my mother so she could handle the local vendors while I focused on my year-end closing at work. I was the silent partner, the benefactor who expected nothing but a place of honor, the head of the table. The weeks leading up to Christmas were a blur of stressful spreadsheets and late-night conference calls. I barely spoke to my parents, but when I did, my mother would gush about the floral arrangements and the hand-carved ice sculptures. She told me the invitations had gone out and that everyone was so excited. I asked several times for the specific date of the gala, but she always brushed it off, saying the venue was still finalizing the permit for the fireworks display, and she would send me the digital calendar invite once it was set in stone. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? I was the one paying for the champagne they would be sipping. I was the person making sure the heating for the rented mansion was covered. I was the reason the event even existed. When I arrived at my parents' house on Christmas Eve, the air felt different. There was a lingering scent of expensive lilies and wood smoke, but the house was quiet. I assumed they were just tired from the preparations for the big event, which I assumed was scheduled for the day after Christmas or perhaps New Year's Eve. I walked in with my suitcase, ready to finally relax and be celebrated as the daughter who had saved the day. Bianca was there, lounging on the sofa in a new designer silk robe that I certainly didn't recognize. She gave me a look that was less of a greeting and more of a challenge. My parents greeted me with stiff hugs and a strange, nervous energy. I chalked it up to the stress of hosting such a massive event. Dinner on Christmas night was a lavish affair, though it was just the 4 of us. The table was laden with food that looked like it had been prepared by a professional chef, not my mother. There were truffles, prime rib, and vintage wines. As I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, I felt a surge of pride. I looked at my family and felt that, for once, I had provided a life for them that they deserved. I leaned forward, my face glowing in the candlelight, and said that I couldn't wait for the big gala. I asked my mother if the caterers for the main event were the same ones who did this dinner, because the quality was incredible. I asked if the musicians were confirmed for the weekend and if I should wear the 4-length emerald gown I had bought specifically for the occasion. The silence that followed was not the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of a trapdoor swinging open. Bianca looked at my mother, then at my father, and then she let out a sharp, jagged laugh that hit me like a physical blow. She leaned back, swirling her wine, and told me that the gala happened last Saturday. She said it was the most beautiful night of their lives. She described the way the lights hit the snow on the estate grounds and how everyone who was anyone had been there. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands going cold as I looked at my mother. I asked her why I was there. I reminded her that I had paid for every single cent of it. I reminded her that I was the reason there was even a party to speak of. My mother wouldn't look me in the eye. She picked at her food and muttered something about how I was so busy with work and they didn't want to distract me. But Bianca wasn't interested in soft lies. She looked me dead in the face and said that they decided it would be better if I was there. She said that my presence always made things feel transactional. She said that because I was the one who paid for it, I would have spent the whole night acting like I owned the place, and they wanted a night where they felt like the ones in charge. She actually thanked me for the money, but told me quite clearly that I wasn't welcome at the event I funded. She said I was the bank, not the guest of honor. My father just nodded, sipping his wine, and told me not to make a scene on Christmas. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It evaporated. The warmth I had felt for my family turned into a cold, hard diamond of clarity. I realized that I had spent years being a ladder for people who only wanted to kick me once they reached the top. I realized that they didn't love me. They loved my balance sheet. I looked at the expensive food on the table, the designer robe Bianca was wearing, and the smug expressions on their faces, and I realized they thought they had won. They thought they could take $40,000 of my hard-earned money, exclude me from the celebration, and I would just sit there and take it because I was the good daughter. They were wrong. They had forgotten one very important detail. I am a forensic accountant by trade. I don't just track money. I track every lie, every hidden debt, and every point of leverage. As I sat there, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply took a bite of the prime rib I had paid for and started calculating exactly how I was going to take back everything they thought was theirs. They wanted a life without my interference, and I was going to give it to them, but it would be a life lived in the ruins of their own greed. I sat at that dinner table for another 20 minutes, listening to Bianca describe the guest list in agonizing detail. She talked about the local politicians who had attended, the business owners my father wanted to impress, and how everyone commented on the sheer opulence of the evening. She mentioned how my mother had been toasted as the premier hostess of the season. Not once did they mention my name to their guests. To the world, this grand display of wealth was theirs, a product of their own success and standing. I realized then that the joint account I had funded wasn't just a convenience for vendor payments. It was a shroud they used to hide my involvement. They had scrubbed me from the narrative of my own life. When I finally excused myself to go to the guest room, my father told me to try and wake up with a better attitude in the morning. He said that resentment was a heavy burden to carry and that I should be happy I could provide such a memory for my parents in their twilight years. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I opened my laptop and began the cold, methodical process of auditing my own family. Since I had been the one managing their messy finances for the last 5 years, I had access to everything. I had the logins for their mortgage portal, their utility accounts, and the various credit cards I had co-signed to help them rebuild their credit. As I dug through the digital trail of the last few months, the betrayal deepened. They hadn't just used the $40,000 for the Gala. My mother had diverted funds into a private savings account for Bianca. They had used my credit line to lease a luxury vehicle that was currently parked in the garage, a car I hadn't even been told about. They were living a life of total fiction, funded entirely by my labor, while treating me like an unwanted interloper in their play-pretend world of high society. By 3 in the morning, I had a clear picture of their house of cards. My parents' home, the one they took so much pride in, was technically held in a family trust that I had helped restructure 2 years ago. Because of the way I had set it up to protect them from creditors, I held a significant portion of the equity as a guarantor. They had defaulted on the private loans I had covered for them months ago, which they conveniently forgot to mention while they were asking for Gala money. I realized that if I withdrew my support, if I stopped the automated transfers and called in the debts they owed to my personal holding company, the entire structure would vanish in less than 30 days. I felt a strange sense of peace as I hovered my cursor over the bank transfer portal. On the morning of December 26th, I came downstairs and found them all gathered in the kitchen, eating a gourmet breakfast of smoked salmon and capers. They were laughing about a funny moment from the gala involving a spilled drink and a local judge. When I sat down, the laughter died down to a polite, strained hum. My mother offered me a bagel without looking at me. I told them I would be heading back to the city early because a major project required my attention. Bianca rolled her eyes and said that I was always obsessed with work and that I should learn to live a little. I smiled at her, a real, genuine smile that seemed to unnerve her. I told her that she was right, and that I was planning on making some major life changes to ensure I was no longer burdened by things that didn't bring me joy. As I drove away from their house, the first thing I did was call my attorney. I didn't want a messy public spat. I wanted a surgical extraction. I instructed him to begin the process of dissolving the family trust, since my parents had violated the terms of our private lending agreement by using funds for unauthorized personal luxuries rather than the debt consolidation we had agreed upon. I had the right to call the notes due immediately. I also called the dealership where the luxury car had been leased. Since my name was the primary on the lease and the insurance, I reported that the vehicle was being operated by unauthorized drivers and requested a remote repossession. The technology in these modern cars is a marvel. With a few verified commands, the car can be disabled and its location sent to a tow crew. I spent the next several days in my high-rise apartment, surrounded by the silence of my own success, watching the dominoes begin to fall. I canceled every credit card where I was the primary account holder. I cut off the cellular plans for lines. I stopped the payments on the premium cable and high-speed internet packages at their house. I even contacted the private security firm that monitored their gated community, informing them that I would no longer be paying the monthly service fee for the address. I was essentially turning off the life support for their social status. I knew that within 48 hours, their world would start to blink out, one light at a time. The first call came from my mother on the 28th. She sounded panicked, telling me that her card had been declined at the grocery store. She said it must be a mistake with the bank and asked me to call my contact at the branch to fix it. I told her very calmly that it wasn't a mistake. I explained that since the gala was over and the money I provided was clearly spent, I had closed the joint account to protect my own assets. I told her that as an adult, she should have her own funds available for groceries. She was silent for a long moment before hanging up. An hour later, Silas called. He was furious. He shouted about the car being towed out of the driveway in broad daylight while the neighbors watched. He demanded to know why I was doing this. I told him that I was simply taking Bianca's advice to heart. I was learning to live a little by removing the stress of managing other people's liabilities. By the end of the week, the legal notices arrived at their doorstep. The trust dissolution was moving forward, and they were served with a formal notice to vacate or refinance the property in their own names within 30 days. I knew they couldn't refinance. No bank in the country would lend it to people with no income and a history of credit defaults. They were trapped. They had spent $40,000 on a single night of vanity, and in doing so, they had handed me the shears to cut the safety net they had been resting in for decades. Bianca sent me a barrage of text messages calling me a monster and a sociopath. She said that I was ruining the family over a single party. I didn't reply to her. Instead, I sent her a line item invoice for every designer dress, every handbag, and every month of rent I had paid for her over the last 3 years. I told her that I would be selling those debts to a collection agency if they weren't settled by the end of the month. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fundamental disrespect of believing that I was a tool to be used and discarded. They thought they were the protagonists of the story, and I was merely the bankroll. They were about to learn that in the real world, The person who holds the keys to the vault is the one who decides when the lights go out. I watched the sunset from my balcony, sipping a glass of wine that I had bought for myself, and I felt no guilt. I felt a profound sense of justice. The gala they loved so much was the last time they would ever stand in a room that expensive, and they had enjoyed it while mocking the person who made it possible. That was a debt that could only be paid in full by the loss of everything they held dear. By the first week of January, the reality of their situation began to settle over their household like a suffocating fog. My father, Silas, who had always carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who assumed the world owed him a living, was the first to break the silence. He called me repeatedly, alternating between weeping and screaming, accusing me of being cold-blooded and calculated. He told me that a daughter's duty was to her parents, regardless of the circumstances. I listened to his rants with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. I reminded him that a parent's duty was generally to love and respect their children, not to embezzle their hard-earned money and exclude them from their own celebrations. I told him that I was simply applying the same logic they had used at the Christmas dinner. They wanted to feel in charge without my interference, and now they were truly in charge of their own destiny. The situation with the house was the most dire for them because I had initiated the dissolution of the family trust. The legal mechanism that protected the property from their previous creditors began to crumble. Without my signature and my ongoing financial guarantees, the mortgage company triggered a review of the accounts. They found the inconsistencies I had flagged, and the grace period they had enjoyed for years was abruptly terminated. My parents had spent so long living in a bubble of my making that they had forgotten how the real world operated. They didn't understand that a bank doesn't care about your social standing or the success of your Christmas gala. A bank only cares about the numbers, and their numbers were a sea of red ink. Bianca was the most vocal in her outrage. She actually had the audacity to show up at my office building in the city, demanding to see me. She was stopped by security at the front desk because I had already placed her on the restricted list. She caused a scene, shouting that I was a traitor to my own blood, until she was eventually escorted out. She then took to social media, trying to launch a smear campaign against me. She posted photos of me from years ago, calling me a bitter, lonely woman who was trying to buy her family's love and failing. She tried to frame the gala as a private family moment that I had ruined with my ego. What she didn't realize was that I had spent the last decade building a reputation in the financial world based on integrity and precision. Her frantic, misspelled posts only served to alienate the very people she was trying to impress. People in our social circles aren't stupid. They saw the luxury she had been flaunting, and they knew she didn't have a job. They began to put the pieces together. The irony of the situation was that the gala, the very thing they used to hurt me, became the catalyst for their social downfall. One of the local business owners who had attended the event reached out to me. He had been suspicious of the sudden display of wealth from Silas and Martha. Knowing their history of failed ventures, he told me that at the party, my father had been bragging about a new investment opportunity he was spearheading. It turns out my father had been using the gala as a platform to solicit money from his friends for a fake real estate scheme. He had planned to use my continued financial support to bridge the gap until he could get his hands on their cash. By cutting him off, I hadn't just taken away his lifestyle, I had exposed his fraud. Without my money to keep the lights on, he couldn't maintain the facade of a successful businessman. The friends who had toasted him at the gala were now calling him, demanding to see the paperwork he had promised. I received a long, rambling email from my mother in the middle of the night. It was filled with excuses. She claimed that she had always intended to tell me about the gala, but that Bianca had convinced her that I would be too stressed with work to enjoy it. She said they used the money for the savings account because they were worried about Bianca's future. She begged me to reconsider the trust dissolution, saying that they were too old to start over. She even tried to guilt me by bringing up my childhood, reminding me of the sacrifices they had made to put me through school. I replied with a single attachment, a scanned copy of my college loan documents. I pointed out that I had paid for my own education through scholarships and 3 part-time jobs, and that I had been paying their mortgage since the year I graduated. I told her that the debt of gratitude she felt I owed her had been paid in full, with interest, 10 times over. The most satisfying part of the process was watching the physical manifestations of their greed disappear. The catering company from the Gala filed a lawsuit against my mother because the final check, drawn from the joint account I had closed, bounced. The florist and the decorators followed suit. The estate where they held the event threatened to sue for damages to the grounds that hadn't been covered by the deposit. My parents were being hit from every side. They had spent $40,000 of my money on a party they couldn't afford, and now they were being asked to pay even more with money they didn't have. They were forced to start selling their belongings. I saw Bianca's designer bags listed on an online resale site. I saw my father's golf clubs and my mother's jewelry appearing in local classifieds. They were stripping their lives bare just to keep the debt collectors at bay. Despite their desperate situation, they still refused to offer a genuine apology. Every communication was a demand or a guilt trip. They still viewed me as a resource rather than a person. They were so blinded by their own entitlement that they couldn't see the path to redemption. If they had come to me with true humility, if they had acknowledged the pain they caused and asked for forgiveness without mentioning money, I might have softened. But they didn't. They stayed true to their characters until the very end. They chose the lie of their own superiority over the truth of our relationship. As the 30-day notice on the house approached its expiration, the tension reached a breaking point. My parents were forced to realize that no one was coming to save them. The cousins and friends who had enjoyed the gala were nowhere to be found when the bills came due. The influential people Silas had tried to court had vanished the moment they sensed the scent of failure. They were alone in that big, drafty house, surrounded by the ghosts of a life they hadn't earned. I felt a cold sense of completion. I had spent my life trying to be the foundation of a family that didn't want me. And now I was watching what happened when that foundation was removed. The structure couldn't hold. It was never meant to. I began to prepare for the final stage of my plan. It wasn't enough for them to be broke. They needed to understand the full weight of what they had thrown away. I had purchased the outstanding debts from several of their vendors through a shell company. I now owned the rights to their arrears. I wasn't just their daughter anymore. I was their primary creditor. I held their future in my hands, and I was going to ensure that every cent was accounted for. They had wanted a night without me. A night where they could pretend I didn't exist while using my life's work to fund their vanity. Now, they would have a lifetime to remember that night, and the cost would be everything they ever owned. Thank you for following my journey through this dark chapter of my life. If you find strength in standing up for yourself and reclaiming your power, please subscribe to my channel, My Calm Revenge. Your support helps me share these stories of justice and personal reclamation. The final day arrived on a Tuesday morning, cold and gray, matching the sterile precision of the legal machinery I had set in motion. I didn't watch from a distance this time. I drove to the house I had spent years paying for, the house that had hosted the gala I was deemed unworthy to attend. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw the moving truck. It wasn't a professional crew. It was a battered, rented van that Silas and Bianca were struggling to load themselves. They looked older, smaller, and significantly less polished than they had on Christmas night. The designer labels were gone, replaced by worn fleece and the frantic, sweaty desperation of people who had finally realized the floor was no longer beneath them. When Silas saw my car, he dropped the box he was carrying. It split open, spilling out the silver platters and crystal glassware they had tried to hide from the inventory list. He walked toward me, his face a mask of purple rage and shattered pride. He started to scream before he even reached my door, calling me a parasite, a monster, and a child of the devil. He told me that he cursed the day I was born because I had no heart. I didn't reel down the window until he was inches away, his breath fogging the glass. When I finally did, I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply handed him a final folder of documents. These were the papers showing that the shell company, which had bought their debts, was now the legal owner of the property. I told him that I wasn't just evicting them. I was the one they would be paying for the next 20 years if they ever hoped to clear their names from the bankruptcy courts. Bianca came running out next, her hair a mess, looking nothing like the socialite she pretended to be on the night of the party. She tried a different tactic. She burst into tears, throwing herself against the side of my car, begging for mercy. She said she was sorry, that the Gala was all a big misunderstanding, and that she had always looked up to me. She said she was homeless and had nowhere to go. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same girl who had laughed in my face while eating the food I paid for. I reminded her of what she told me at dinner. I told her that she was right. My presence made things feel transactional. So, I was keeping this strictly transactional. I told her that if she wanted a place to stay, she could look into the local shelters I had spent the morning donating to in her name. I had made a massive contribution to the city's housing programs using the money I had recovered from their frozen accounts. My mother stayed inside the house until the very last moment. When she finally emerged, she was carrying a single framed photo of the four of us from 10 years ago. She didn't scream or cry. She looked at me with a hollow, vacant expression. She asked me if I was happy now that I had won. I told her that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about balance. I explained that for 29 years, I had carried the weight of the family in my back while they sat in the carriage and whipped me to go faster. I told her that I had simply stepped out from under the harness. If the carriage rolled backward into the ravine, that wasn't my doing. It was gravity. I told her that the $40,000 they spent on a single night of lies was the price of their entire future. They had traded their home, their security, and their daughter for a few hours of feeling important in front of people who didn't even like them. As they drove away in that cramped, rented van, leaving the keys on the porch, I walked into the house alone. It was empty and echoed with the sound of my footsteps. I walked into the grand dining room where the betrayal had been finalized. I could still see the faint outlines on the floor where the heavy furniture had been. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the silence. It didn't feel like a victory in the way people imagine. It felt like a cleansing. I had spent so much of my life trying to fill this house with my achievements and my money, hoping it would turn into a home. I realize now that it was just a building, and the people inside had been ghosts of who I wanted them to be. I didn't keep the house. I sold it to a developer who planned to turn the land into a community park. I wanted the physical structure of my trauma to be leveled to the ground. I used the proceeds from the sale to set up a trust fund, but not for them. I set it up for students from backgrounds like mine, people who were the workhorses of their families, to give them an exit strategy before they were bled dry. I wanted to ensure that no one else had to fund their own exclusion. The legal battle took another 6 months to fully resolve. But in the end, Silas and Martha were forced into a small, state-subsidized apartment in a town 3 hours away. Bianca had to take a job working retail, the very kind of work she used to mock, and she was quickly discovered to be unqualified for even that. The fallout in our social circle was absolute. Once the truth about the Gala and the fraudulent investment schemes came out, my parents were priors. The people who had attended the party were the first ones to point fingers and distance themselves. They were embarrassed that they had been fooled by a couple who was essentially living on their daughter's charity. My father's reputation was destroyed beyond repair. He reached out to me one last time, months later, asking for a loan to start a small business. I didn't even read the full email. I marked it as spam and went back to my life. I am 29, and for the first time in my life, I am free. I no longer check my bank accounts with a sense of dread, wondering what disaster I'll have to pay for next. I no longer wait for a phone call that only comes when someone needs something. I have surrounded myself with people who value me for my mind and my character, not my credit limit. I spent Christmas this year alone, by choice, on a beach in a country where no one knows my name. I sat under the stars, listening to the waves, and I realized that the best thing I ever bought with my money was my own silence and my own peace. The revenge wasn't in the poverty I forced them into. The revenge was in the fact that I survived them. I didn't become bitter like Silas, or manipulative like my mother, or shallow like Bianca. I took the fire they tried to burn me with and I used it to forge a life that they can no longer touch. They lost everything because they thought I was a resource, and they forgot that a resource can be depleted. They thought I was a background character in their play, but I was the one who owned the theater. When the play turned into a tragedy of their own making, I simply closed the curtains and walked out into the light. I often think back to that moment at the dinner table when Bianca left and told me I wasn't welcome. I think about the look of triumph on her face. I hope she remembers that look every time she pays her rent with a paycheck she actually had to work for. I hope my parents remember the taste of that expensive wine every time they sit in their cramped kitchen. They wanted a life without me, and they got exactly what they asked for. They have their memories of one grand night, and I have the rest of my life. My journey has taught me that blood doesn't make you family. Respect, loyalty, and love do. If those things are present, then the relationship is just a debt that needs to be settled. I have settled all my accounts. My ledgers are clean. I am no longer Addison the provider or Addison the bank. I am just Addison, and for the first time, that is more than enough. I hope my story serves as a reminder to anyone out there who feels used or undervalued by those who are supposed to protect them. You have the power to change the narrative. You have the right to walk away from people who only see you as a means to an end. It may be painful, and it may require a coldness you didn't know you possessed, but the peace on the other side is worth every struggle. Thank you for listening to my calm revenge. Please like this video and share with friends. Don't forget to subscribe our channel and press the bell icon for more updates.